One of the most fundamental aspects of SEO is making sure that Google can crawl your website. Google can't crawl your website, then nothing else really matters. One thing that can really affect how Google crawls your website is JavaScript. In this video, let's talk about how JavaScript impacts SEO. To begin, Google is able to execute some JavaScript on websites. That wasn't always the case, but over the last decade or so, Google's gotten a lot more sophisticated in what they're able to do when it comes to JavaScript. That doesn't mean you should use every piece of JavaScript available and assume Google will be able to execute that successfully, but that does mean that you have a lot more flexibility than you did in the past. Before we get too deep into talking about what Google can and cannot do, let's take a step back and talk about how content is loaded. And really, there's two ways that content is loaded on a website: server-side rendering and client-side rendering. Rendering just means that things are displayed in the browser. So it can be displayed in the browser through server-side code or client-side code. What's server-side rendering? Server-side rendering means that the web server generates a particular page and sends it over to the browser. And all the browser has to do is display that page to visitors or bots. The browser doesn't have to do any additional work, doesn't have to manipulate things whatsoever. There's no JavaScript involved. Then we have client-side code. Client-side code is code that the browser does manipulate, and the browser manipulates the code in response to instructions from JavaScript. How this works is every time you do something in a browser, there's an event that's fired. That event might be a load event that fires when the page is loaded. There's click events. Those happen when somebody clicks on an item or taps on an item. Then we have scroll events. Those happen when somebody scrolls down the page. There's mouse movement events, events related to forms, and so on. And so every time one of those events fires in the browser goes through and listens for those events and says, okay, an event was fired. Is there a JavaScript that I need to call in response to this event? And if there is, then the browser will execute that JavaScript. And when that JavaScript is executed, it might change something about the content on the page, might add images to the page, might add text to the page. So the question becomes, what can Googlebot support? Googlebot can absolutely support server-side code. The most reliable method for making sure that Google can crawl and access something on your website is to have it in the server-side code. Google will get that server-side code from the server. They'll be able to see whatever's contained within it. But when it comes to client-side code, the answer's not as simple. With client-side code, Google can execute only one of those events in the browser, the load event. So any JavaScript that's called in response to the onload event is something that Googlebot should be able to see, assuming everything works within the JavaScript, that there's no errors, etc. But any of the other events that happen in a browser, click events, scroll events, mouse events, whatever, is not something that Googlebot will be able to do. They just don't trigger those types of events. And if they don't trigger those types of events, they'll never see any JavaScript that's called in response to those events. A common example of where I see sites run into trouble with this is with things like accordions. With an accordion, when you click to expand, you see additional content. It's a nice, helpful feature and a good way to present additional content on a page. In most cases, the content contained in that accordion comes from the server-side code. In other cases, it's from the onload client-side code, the client-side code that's generated in response to those onload events in the browser. But in some cases, the content that appears in the accordion is only loaded into the page in response to the click event. So there's no content there until you click to expand the accordion. And when you click to expand the accordion, then the content is loaded. And if that's the case, that's not content Google will be able to see. They don't click to expand those accordions. Google can see that content if it's loaded in the server-side code or the onload code, but not if it's loaded in response to the click event. So you need to test this out, and you need to see which content Google will be able to see or not be able to see depending on how JavaScript works on your website. One way that you can test this out is by turning off JavaScript completely in the browser and then loading your website. Now, don't get me wrong, Google can load some JavaScript, so this is a very extreme example, but by turning off JavaScript completely, you'll get a real clear sense of how dependent your website is on JavaScript. Obviously, Google is not loading your website in this state. They are loading some JavaScript. but this just gives you a sense of how JavaScript really is working on your website. One tool that you can use for this is a plugin called Toggle JavaScript. It allows you to turn JavaScript on or off in Chrome. And when you go to your website and you have JavaScript turned off, you'll be able to see right away what kind of problems might exist. Some cases you turn off JavaScript and nothing changes on the website. All of your content is there, all of your navigation is there, all of your links is there, and you're able to go around. Maybe there's some animations missing, tracking script certainly won't work with JavaScript turned off, but for the most part, your website works. Everything is present, no big deal. Google will be able to work with that website and see all your content just fine. In other cases, you turn off JavaScript and nothing shows up whatsoever. You have a blank screen, no links, no content, nothing is shown when you view the code. There's nothing on your page. That's a big problem, or could be a big problem for your website and for how Google interacts with your website. A more sophisticated way that you can test this out and a better way to really mimic how Google is loading your page is by using a headless browser. I have a separate video where I talk through how you can set up and utilize a headless browser, so I encourage you to check that out. But the general idea behind a headless browser is you can load a page in the same way Googlebot loads a page, including being able to load your page with executing those onload JavaScript functions. And then you can look at the code that comes back from the headless browser. You can make sure all of your content is there, make sure all of your images are there, make sure all of the links to various pages are present in the code as well. And if it's all there, great, then you don't have any problems. But if you look at the code that came back from the headless browser and things are missing, then you have work to do. So next, let's talk about what you can do and what developers can do to help Google understand content that is contained in JavaScript. And there's two main methods we want to talk about: noscript tags and dynamic rendering. A noscript tag contains content that is shown to visitors who are unable to execute the JavaScript commands. And so with the noscript tag, you can place any content inside that noscript tag. So that way Google will be able to see that even if they don't click on certain items, even if they don't scroll to certain items down the page. A common example of this is lazy loading images. A lazy load image is not there by default. It requires scrolling down the page for that image to be loaded. But obviously Google's not going to scroll down the page. Instead, you can place the image inside a noscript tag so that way Google can still see the image even if they don't scroll. Now, the other method we have available is dynamic rendering. With dynamic rendering, you're loading two different sets of code, one for bots and one for visitors. Visitors get your ordinary code with all the JavaScript involved. But for bots, they get a pre-rendered version of your code, a version of your code where you've gone through and you've executed all the JavaScript already in advance for bots, and you've rendered everything that comes out of those JavaScript functions for them, and you're giving bots that pre-rendered version of the page. That way Google doesn't have to execute any JavaScript whatsoever. They just see the end state of that page after all the JavaScript has been rendered. This is a little more involved to set up, but the general idea is that you detect if there's a bot that is coming to your page, and if you see that it's Googlebot coming to your page, then you give them the pre-rendered version of the page, and if it's not Googlebot, you give them the ordinary version of the page. If you are using dynamic rendering, you want to make sure you maintain equivalency between the version of the page bots see and the version of the page visitors see. So long as all you're doing is pre-rendering JavaScript, you should be fine. But where people can get in trouble is if you try and sneak in additional content to the bots version of the page, or sneak in something extra to the bots version of the page that only bots will be able to see. Then you're going to start running into issues with cloaking or issues with manipulating bots, and that can lead to penalties or manual actions. But so long as you're really truly just pre-rendering the JavaScript for bots, you're not going to get into any trouble. There's obviously a lot involved with JavaScript, so if you have other questions, please let me know. You can email me at matthew@elementive.com. If you liked this video and would like to see more like it, please subscribe. Also, I encourage you to check out that other video I mentioned about headless browsers, because that really is a key tool to understanding JavaScript. Thanks for watching.